Is the trend for story branding and story over for entrepreneurs? I'm Dr. Dan, I'm a coach, I'm a strategist, passionate about the brain, I'm very passionate about story, and most importantly, fired up about you taking your message to the masses. Recently, I was in a conversation with an entrepreneur who said,
"That story brand ship has sailed."
and what he meant by that is the power of story and this talk about story and making sure you nail your story. He said that ship has sailed. And I looked at him and I said, that ship may have sailed, but I can tell you right now, there were not enough people on it. And here's what I mean by that. When I look left and right, the majority of you, speaking to you, are not using your story in a way that you should or could. You are missing out on the single greatest element ever known to man if you're trying to get somebody to believe differently and behave differently. And I will prove it to you. It is just inside of us. I wrote a book called The Trust Formula: How to Create Influence and Income for Entrepreneurs Who Hate Selling. Let me tell you, if you didn't read it, which you should, the secret is that you need to use the power of story. Now, I could get on here and I could say, there's research that shows when you use story, you get somebody to remember your message 22 times more than without a story. Or using the power of story in sales increases the value of your product, service, and offer by 28 times. But those would be facts. What I really want to tell you is a story about Elliot. Elliot was an individual who had a brain tumor. The surgeons took out his brain tumor, and within a few months, Elliot ends up losing his job, his wife, his family, and his relationships. Elliot then applies for disability, and his case shows up on the desk of a neuropsychologist named Antonio Damasio. Antonio was charged with determining if this disability case was valid. And what Elliot was pointing out is that ever since his surgery, something happened to his brain that has changed his entire life. So Antonio dives in and looks at the area of his brain that the tumor was taken out of. Well, coincidentally, the same area of the brain where the tumor was is the area that controls emotions. And so when they took out the tumor, they also took out that part of the brain, which was a smart thing to do because they didn't want any of the tumor to stay in there. But it turned out to be very harmful for Elliot. What you need to understand is that emotions drive all decisions, every single one. And since Elliot had the part of his brain removed that control emotions, he had the part of his brain removed that controls his decision making. So he would go to work and he would refile the file cabinet all day. Or he would go home and not be checked in at all for his spouse. He would not respond or answer her simple questions because the emotional center of the brain is the decision maker. So if you ask if the story ship has sailed, I'll be the first to tell you it will never sail. Humans think in stories. Stories hit on the emotional aspect of the brain like nothing else. You've watched a movie, you've watched a documentary, you've read a book, you've heard a story that has compelled you to make a decision, to behave differently, to believe differently. And if you have a business, that means you need to sell. That means you need to convince or persuade somebody to do something. A story is the single greatest way to do it. Not only that, a story, to Donald Miller's point, is the best branding you'll ever have because of the way a story impacts the human brain. When I think about the power and influence of story, I'm reminded of a quote by Victor Hugo, who said, "There's only one thing more powerful than all the armies in the world, and that is an idea whose time has come." I'm telling you right now, story has come, but it needs to continue. We have been a species that think because we've evolved, we now make decisions with rational, deliberate, logical reasons. And that could not be further from the truth. The evidence is crystal clear. And for me, I'm a first principles guy. I go back to breaking things down on its lowest common denominator. And when you study the brain, you realize the brain is wired for story. I also study, how did God create us? And it turns out the way that God speaks to us through His Word, His Bible, 43% of it is story. What did Jesus use? Parables. Those are short stories. What did we hear when we were kids to learn how to navigate the world? Stories. What does the fMRI technology tell us when a brain hears a story? It is influenced like no other form of communication can do. Now, you may say, I'm biased. because that's what I talk about in my book, The Power of Story. But it's not that. I'm not biased because that's what I talk about in my book. I talk about in my book because I've been convinced and persuaded from my own journey, from the science, and from all the evidence that I see out there. And I just ask you that question. What are you most influenced by? Think about it. Now, I know the answer, and even if you were trying to convince me otherwise, you're wrong. You can't even articulate how much a story impacts you because that's how your brain thinks. One thing I find very fascinating is that when you really look at what the entrepreneurs and influencers are teaching, all of them are saying the same thing. Tony Robbins, Brendon Burchard, Ed Mylett, Russell Brunson, the list goes on. Hook, story, offer. Everything needs a story. People buy you. Simon Sinek, people buy the why you do what you do. Apple, the greatest, biggest company of all time, arguably the best company of all time to date, uses story. It took 9 pages of features and benefits down to 2 words, think differently, because Steve Jobs came back after studying with the greatest storytellers of all time because he was a part of Pixar, which took 2 years to develop the movie Toy Story, and he comes back to Apple after that saying, we got to tell more stories. We got to be focused on our customer and we got to tell more stories. Why would you be any different? The question now becomes, how do you tell a compelling story? Not has that ship sailed? Your question should be, how do I tell a good story? And I'm going to tell you, it's easier than you think. There's 3 key ingredients. Number 1 is you got a protagonist, which is a main character. The second P is you got a problem. You don't have a story without a problem. And the third thing is you have a principle. So a protagonist is the main character. A problem is the conflict that they encounter, and the principle is when they encounter that, what does every listener actually remember and take home as a lesson from the story? I'll give you an example. The story of 3 frogs starting a grueling race. As the gun was fired and 3 frogs start this race, all the crowd yells,
Stop going. This is a grueling race. Nobody ever makes it. You'll never make it. Just stop now.
Frog number 1 stops right away. Frog number 2 lasts a couple more minutes and then he bows out based on the exhaustion and based on the noise from the crowd. Frog number 3, however, keeps going and going and going and finishes the entire race.
Hello there.
At the end of the race, they come up to frog number 3 and say, how did you finish this race? And the frog never answers because it turns out he was deaf. And all along the way, when everybody else was hearing all the negative of why you can't do it, he didn't hear any of it. The moral to that story, right? The principle of that story is don't listen to what others have to say. They always want to tear you down. Be frog number 3. You see, there was a protagonist, which was frog number 3. There was a problem, which was this jeering audience saying, stop, stop, stop. You'll never make it. You aren't good enough. And then there was a principle that says, don't listen to others. You see that every story must have a protagonist, which is the main character. It has a problem or a conflict, and it has a principle. It's that simple. Story changes lives. Stories build trust. Story is going to be the key ingredient for your next level of success and growth. Mark it down, take it to the bank. If you need help with it, that's why I wrote the book. That's why I do my coaching. Check the link below. I would love to help you with it. Story is here and it's here to stay, especially if you're an entrepreneur and you know deep down you have more to do. You have a big mission and you know you're capable. So hey, if you are that person that I'm talking about, that entrepreneur with a big mission and you know there's more in the tank, you want more content like this to help you go to the next level, click the subscribe button, leave me a comment, debate me, challenge me, just spell my name right. I'm here for all of it to bring you truth. No matter what level of experience you have, you can go to the next level, and I want to show you why. Dr. Dan, I'm out.